I'm Matt Adler. I'm looking for a word to describe my mental state right now. What would it be? Oh, I'm happy. I'm very happy. Although, some of you know I'm a skeptic about happiness in some ways, but I am genuinely happy to have so many great academics here to talk about happiness, to look at new scholarship about happiness, and among other things, to think about the normative or policy implications of happiness. So on the first, for each of the panels, except the last today, but for this one and the next, we're going to have two papers. My aim is to both allow the presenters to get across the main substance of the paper, but then to have a vigorous conversation. So the ground rules are that each presenter will go for no more than 20 minutes, 15 is fine, no more than 20 minutes. We'll have each paper in succession. I would say to hold questions except for genuinely clarifying questions, and I realize that itself may not be clear, but hold questions, and then the commentator will basically just oversee conversation. I'll keep the cue. So without further ado, very happy to have Dan Haybron, who I'm sure everyone in the room knows, a very influential philosophical writer in happiness. Jenny Hawkins, ditto. Dan's going to talk first 15, 20 minutes about his paper, then Jenny, and then we will have a conversation.
Yeah, I want to thank Matt and for putting this on, and Dawn and the Law Center for. I'm looking forward to a lot of interesting talks and conversations here. I'm gonna skim the surface of parts of my paper, which some of you might have noticed is a little long. Just as background, I'm going to assume that well-being policy is a legitimate enterprise, and that governments should be neutral about the philosophical theories of well-being, instead just promoting what it is that people value for themselves, whatever the correct theory of well-being is. So Valerie Tiberius and I call this approach pragmatic subjectivism, and one upshot of this is that there's not going to be any one gold standard measure of well-being. Governments are going to want to use a variety of welfare indicators. So what I want to focus on is what sort of headline measures should we look for well-being policy. That is maybe roughly in the vein of the role that GDP plays in policy, although not necessarily supplanting that. But what would be the most important measures to bring on board for well-being policy? And this is a bit of a tricky question because it's partly a philosophical question, but it's also an empirical and practical political question. And this is very much a work in progress given the complexity of the issues. But I'm really interested in I want to set aside for the most part issues of psychometrics about how the instruments behave and focus really on what, sort of a wish list, what kind of information we should want to have for policymaking purposes. And one obvious candidate here is subjective well-being, which, crudely speaking, is normally thought of as having two components. On the one hand, life satisfaction, sort of a judgment, cognitive component, and on the other hand, I'll just call it affect balance, the feelings, emotional component. And I think subjective well-being is a pretty natural candidate for a headline measure of well-being, at least if it behaves well enough in the wild, because there's a broad consensus about the importance of subjective well-being. Think about the popularity of hedonism about well-being. Even if it's wrong, it probably isn't wildly off the mark. And it also seems to enjoy a natural connection with what people care about, people's values. So from a policy perspective, that's an attractive feature. What I want to focus on is whether the standard metrics of subjective well-being as normally conceptualized actually gives us the kind of information we want. In principle, should we even expect it to give us the right information? And I want to suggest that it's actually slightly off target in a couple of ways. The first thing I want to do is just set aside one kind of kind of construct that I think it's conflated with other issues in subjective well-being research. And under the heading of affect balance, there's really two different things that people tend, I think, are concerned with. Call this, the broad rubric, quality of experience. Unfortunately, I wrote this before I had read Matt's paper. It really should be EQ, experience quality. But essentially, what's the flow of your experience like from moment to moment? How good or bad is your experience? And the most obvious measure here, which sometimes affect balance measures are just treated as hedonic balance measures. How pleasant or unpleasant is your experience? And note, though, if that's what you're interested in, you might want to include like measures of physical pain and pleasure as well as emotions. Back pain you would think would be an important thing to look at. But the pleasantness of our experience isn't the only aspect of it we might care about. We might also care about how meaningful things seem to us while we're doing it. And Paul Dolan and colleagues have been exploring that kind of a measure. I think quality of experience measures are, at least, it's a little unclear to me what role they should have in policy. It seems to me they're especially useful in the context of time use surveys, where you want to see how people are allocating their time and whether the activities they're allocating time to are relatively pleasant, like commute, or unpleasant, like commuting versus socializing. But I think classically subjective well-being research is more interested in general evaluations. Trying to get in one relatively neat package a sense of a person's overall well-being, at least in important respects. And this, what I call general evaluation, can have two aspects again, both cognitive and affective. I'm going to adopt a broader rubric of life evaluation for the judgment side of it, for reasons we'll see in a moment. And then you can also think about not just a person's judgment about their life, but actually their overall emotional response to their life. And I'll use the term emotional well-being, which has some currency in the literature, but hasn't been really standardized in its meaning. And you can think of emotional well-being as essentially the person's emotional condition, their overall emotional orientation or response or disposition in response to their life. So is the person reacting favorably in emotional terms to her life? And it's helpful to think of emotional well-being as roughly the opposite of anxiety and depression. And you can think of depression as a sort of a really negative evaluation of your life from an emotional perspective. In my work, I've argued that happiness is actually most usefully understood in terms of emotional well-being. For policy purposes, I think, since there's no philosophical consensus on this point, and the word sows so much confusion, it would be best to avoid it, that point, and I won't put much weight on it. So it's important to understand that emotional well-being is not just about feeling happy or smiley face feelings. I like smiley face feelings, but there's much more to it than that. So imagine two fictional communities. First, happy Eudonia, where the average person tends to be at ease, untroubled, slow to anger, quick to laugh, fulfilled in an expansive and self-assured mood, curious and attentive, alert and in good spirits, and fully at home in her body with a relaxed, confident posture. Over in poor old Latin-speaking Maldonia, the average person tends to be stressed, anxious, tense, irritable, worried, wary, distracted and self-absorbed, uneasy, awkward and insecure, spiritually deflated, pinched, and compressed. I take it there's a massive difference in quality of life between these communities. Policy really wants to avoid turning Eudonias into Maldonias, and I consider these to be essentially concerned with emotional well-being. And the problem with the standard affect balance instruments is that they tend to focus just on feeling inventories, basically. How many times do you feel happy or sad? Were you feeling angry when you got cut off in traffic? That sort of thing. And there's a lot more to our emotional lives than just those discrete eruptions of emotion. Our background moods, being tense or stressed is not something that would necessarily turn up very well in these kind of inventories. One way to see the difference between hedonic balance and emotional well-being is think of a phenomenon we can call hedonic compensation. Suppose you've recently lost your spouse, you're grieving. Emotionally, you're not in very good shape. It takes very little to bring you to tears or even to panic. But you manage actually most of the time to have a pretty pleasant experience of things because you keep yourself distracted with busy work, going out with friends, and so forth. So that you might end up in a state of low emotional well-being, but your hedonic balance may not be bad. And there's actually some evidence from a study in Germany, which I won't discuss here, but that sort of unfortunately, I wasn't able to use this picture in my book. Anyway, this actually might happen with unemployed populations. Probably the biggest question is, how would you measure emotional well-being? And I actually think one of the weirdest things I think about subjective well-being research, I mean, I'm a big fan of it, but is that it just seems completely disconnected from this vast body of literature on mental health that has been concerned with emotional well-being for decades. And they've developed, they're well aware of the issues of self-reports, and they've developed lots of fairly sophisticated instruments for assessing emotional well-being, focused obviously more on the negative end of the spectrum. I don't see any reason think that these couldn't be extended to form broad spectrum measures of emotional well-being. And in fact, for instance, the hospital anxiety and depression scale, just to give one example, a lot of the questions are actually positive questions. And notice, some of them take the form like this: I can laugh and see the funny side of things. That's not even asking about what experiences you've had. It's asking you about your disposition. And my conjecture would be that these kind of measures could better discriminate cases like eudaimonia and maldonia and give a better sense of the magnitude of the differences. I don't emphasize this in the paper, but I would add, I also think in this realm that physiological measures, especially perhaps salivary and hair cortisol studies, could be very helpful in this regard, especially looking across cultures. Now, the other side of subjective well-being, life evaluation, like life satisfaction, you might think this is all you need for policy. I mean, if what matters is what people want, then, people tend to know what they want. They tend to know how things are going in their lives. So you would think, just ask them, how are things going in your life? And that would give you a pretty good sense of their well-being. And another nice thing is it seems like a relatively neutral measure, right? Whatever you care about. If you live in a highly interdependent communal society in East Asia, and you don't care about feeling good so much, then that will show up in your life satisfaction reports, you would think. The life satisfaction measure, that's the standard type of instrument for life evaluation. I want to say at the outset, I think in general, it performs well enough that it has provided a lot of useful information, and on average, it tends to, it correlates pretty well with the things you'd expect it to, and so forth. But it still has some fairly serious, in principle, problems, and I don't see any way around these. First of all, it involves a global judgment. Essentially, you're asked to treat your life like a gymnastics routine and sum it all up in a single number. And that's really hard to do. It's even hard to do that for a single day, much less your life as a whole. And so it's going to be a large dose of arbitrariness from, I think, any normal person's perspective in summing up their whole life in a global judgment in one number. Less obvious is that life satisfaction embodies a satisfaction judgment. It's not actually a judgment about whether your life is going well relative to what you care about. It's about whether your life is good enough, whether it's satisfactory. So it's actually perceived good enoughness is really what life satisfaction assesses. And I personally have no idea how good a life is good enough for me, but I'm happy to pretty much put the bar just about anywhere that will suit my purposes. At any rate, I think for most psychologically healthy individuals, it's going to be fairly arbitrary what they count as a good enough life. And in fact, just to highlight the worry, you could think your life is going badly for you and still be satisfied with it and not be making a mistake. It's just this is the nature of what it means to be satisfied with your life. Because, hey, at least you're alive. Beats being dead. So Slava Ibrahim asked Egyptians, poor Egyptians who were reported being satisfied with their lives, well, why are you satisfied with your life? And they didn't say things, they didn't always say things like, well, my family's great, I love what I do for a living. They say things like, one day is good, the other one is bad, whoever accepts the least lives. Which is sort of a way of saying, life is basically a kick in the teeth, but what can you do? It's good enough. Who am I to complain? This does not look like people reporting highly successful, flourishing lives. It's more like resignation. And these aren't mistakes. This is just how the norms that govern life satisfaction attitudes behave. Now, the problems I've been talking about so far suggest that life satisfaction I think it's really not reliable for telling us in absolute terms how people are doing. And there's just no way of saying in any meaningful, interesting way that people are happy from the fact that they're satisfied or that they're doing well. And in fact, I think that feature of them really attracts a lot of negative attention that they could be changed to avoid that. At any rate, still, in telling us about relative levels of well-being, they look in general to be fairly reliable. Higher life satisfaction, groups who report higher life satisfaction do seem on average to be doing better relative to what they care about than groups reporting lower satisfaction. But it could be that everybody has just lowered the bar for satisfactoriness, that everybody says they're satisfied, but still the better off people report being more satisfied. The big problem that remains, however, is that in certain cases, hopefully not too many, there are various biases that can throw off the results where the groups you're comparing are answering the questions in different ways. And for example, groups differ in norms regarding positive responding. So Americans might report more positively than Italians who are doing just as well. Rich people, where I live anyway, basically get paid to seem happy. Mechanics where I live don't. So you might expect rich people to report higher satisfaction than poorer people. In any event, dialysis patients report massive dissatisfaction with being on dialysis. That is an extremely strong preference to get off it, but it doesn't show up in their life satisfaction reports, probably because they they cope with this obvious misfortune by lowering the bar. Salience, I conjecture the life satisfaction measures tend to track not so much people's values, what they really think is important in life, but more their priorities, where their attention is focused in life. Once you have kids, you may have had a huge leap forward in how well your life is going for you because you've now avoided childlessness and you've met one of your great life goals. But after about 3 days, that may cease to have any bearing on your life satisfaction reports. Whereas things like money are going to be foremost, chronically salient. So very quickly, how do we deal with these problems with life evaluation? I think they are dealable. And one thing to remember is those biases aren't necessarily problems in every context. I think there are lots of settings where there's no reason to expect the biases are explaining the results. So one thing is just, we can just do away with the satisfaction paradigm and focus on measuring perceived well-being. And some of the measures actually do that, like the Cantrell ladder doesn't ask people if they're satisfied, just compares their lives to best possible or worst possible life. And because at any rate, there's no reliable way to get absolute levels of well-being information out of these reports, but rather at relative levels, I think we should consider just changing the scales and the presentation of the data so that it's, it doesn't naturally encourage people to say, oh, people are happy, oh, they're doing well, therefore they're fine. As in people in the slums of Calcutta who report positive life satisfaction, or the poor people in Egypt. But any global life evaluation is still going to have a problem of, that the gymnastics routine, apples and oranges. So I think it would be helpful to, look more carefully at aggregate life evaluation measures. Basically, break it down and focus more on more particular localized judgments that are going to be more strongly reality constrained. So for example, perhaps, and I'm just, this is, I don't know if this will work in practice, but a D index, say. What are the top 10 things that you would most like to see improved in your life? How important are they? How strongly would you, and presumably like the dialysis patients would list, their kidney problems somewhere on there. So that would at least recover, I think, some of the information that's missing in life satisfaction. Then just more familiarly, like domain satisfaction, but again, we don't need to use the satisfaction rubric, just ask people how well are things going in these important domains. So in a nutshell, there's really no single gold standard measure that I think leaps out as, well, this is all we need. But I'm not sure at this point very many people expect that. And I do think, and so this is just sort of summarizing. My own bet, and I haven't really said anything about it here, but is that emotional well-being, at least if you can get reasonably reliable indicators of it, and here looking at like the depression and anxiety instruments would be helpful. That this is probably the most promising single measure, but even that's not going to get everything, and it's not going to be a standalone measure. But it is, I think, quite a useful one, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Jenny will go again 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation.
How do I find my slides?
I think it should be there.
Okay.
Oh,
I have a handout for people who would.
I'm not sure how to get out of it. By the way, the owner of those nets was just in the Capitol last week, basically begging for his professional life against a commercial fishing ban.
They should make their way around if they're run out. You know.
Let me get going.
Sure. Let's see. Sorry, I didn't see what was happening. Oh, I'm going up here.
Yeah, so Jenny is Hawkins. Is here.
Hawkins is down
He's
here.
down here, so we can just maximize that.
Perfect. For this computer, click to use the computer, and then if you need anything in the room, it's just the
Oh, I
touch
see.
screen.
Okay, so click.
It's
and
so confusing.
Got it.
Sorry
Okay.
about
No,
that.
no problem.
There you go.
Okay. And there's this. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I'm very happy to be here at this highly interdisciplinary conference, this may be one of the few talks, not the only one, but one of the few talks that doesn't present any data, my own or others, being a philosophy talk. What I want to do, my project, what I'm involved in and what I've given you a slice of today to digest, if you can, is to try to develop a theory of well-being. So many of us, in many of our work, are engaged in trying to clarify certain concepts, but the project of developing a theory is to try to take many of the common judgments that we make and develop an account that explains why these are all judgments about the same thing, how they relate to one another. And I should just say, for those who sometimes think of the projects philosophers engage in as just trying to sort through intuitions, I don't see it as just doing that. For I doubt you'd get much interesting out of that. And even if you could make all the various things we think about well-being sort of consistent, which itself would be a big task, that still wouldn't give you a theory that explains why we think those things are important, how to put them together. So I take my project to go beyond just our intuitions. I hope it's revisionary and explanatory, though hopefully not in any too radical way. Okay. Before launching into the details of the theory I want to present, I want to just say a few things that I think are crucial to my approach to well-being, and I think should be present in any theory. All too often, the philosophical literature on well-being has focused on just giving us an account of what's good, but a theory of well-being is really a theory of ill-being as well, for lack of a better term. We need to know, as philosophers would say, we want a theory of prudential value, a full theory that's going to tell us why the good things are good, why the bad things are bad, and how they're related to each other. How do we understand the gradations? And so one way of thinking about that I employ is to think about a theory of well-being as something that's going to give you a ranking. It's going to help you to understand how to rank possible lives, or perhaps, as more relevantly, since most of us are already launched, how to rank possible continuations of a life. It doesn't assume that there's only one option at each ranking level, right? But it just assumes that insofar as you think certain lives or ways of continuing your life are better than others, the theory should show you why you rank the way you rank, right? Okay. A good theory, I think, may also end up being fairly complex. I mean, you don't have to start with the assumption, but you shouldn't shy away from it. Some philosophical theorists have wanted very simple theories, but then I think they've turned out to be somewhat distorting. So I think we should just go where our best arguments take us and not worry too much about this. Sometimes people say to me, well, but if you have a complex theory, then it's not practically useful. And I say, well, what you want to figure out is what really works, what the truth is. And then if you have a complex theory and you want to use it for practical purposes, you may have to make some simplifying assumptions, but that's okay, as long as it's still useful to know what it is you're trying to simplify. And you can only do that if you first get clear what you think well-being is. Philosophers often say to me, too, well, it might have the implication that knowledge of your good is if you get a complex theory, it might be hard to know what's good for you. Hedonism, which says that your good is just whatever gives you pleasure, was a very simple theory, and it made it quite easy to know what's good for you, because most of us can figure out at least some things that give us pleasure. And a very simple desire theory would have the same result, too, because most of us know what we want. If you get into informed desire theories, it gets more complex. But if you just take what we want as our good, well, that entails that knowledge of our good is very easy. But I actually think that knowledge of what's good for us may actually be quite hard, which is why we make so many mistakes in our lives, and more recent psychology supports that we're not always the best at getting it perfect. At any rate, it doesn't seem to me to be a flaw of a theory that it makes knowledge of your good something epistemically complicated or elusive. That actually seems right to me. Okay, and I also just want to say from the outset that I think any good theory of well-being has to have a very good richly detailed, clear account of key psychological concepts. One of the problems in the history of philosophical approaches to well-being has been a too impoverished philosophy of mind. Okay, I was going to give, as a brief example, all the different things people have meant by happiness, but Dan already did some of that. I think one of the advantages of an approach like his to defining happiness in terms of emotional state is that it does a much better job of explaining why happiness might be important. Often, if you think happiness is just the same as pleasure or some very superficial smiley face feeling, as he said, then you're going to have a very different take on how important happiness is. But whatever you think it is, it's really important that you make it clear, because people can talk past each other. One person thinking it's the smiley face feeling and going, happiness isn't important, and somebody else thinking it is. So we need to be careful. Okay. Now, my own thinking about well-being, what's gone into my approach to the theory that I take, is very dependent on a distinction between affect and what I'm going to call, for lack of a better, good contrasting term, attitudes. So let me say a little bit about what I mean by affect. Affect, in psychology literature, people use it in lots of different ways, but it's often just used as a kind of synonym for emotional phenomena or emotions plus moods. I'm going to use the term affective state to refer to wide-ranging, long-lasting dispositions that shape our emotions and our moods. So I'll just remind you briefly what emotions and moods are, what I take them to be. Emotions, I think, are dispositions to respond in very specific ways to particular stimuli. They have an element of evaluation in them. So to be angry, you're responding, you've made an assessment or appraisal, as some people prefer to use, that something insulting perhaps has been said, and this may then give you dispositions to react in a hostile manner, to say certain things, to, at the very least, to carry away with you a much more negative impression of the person who said that. There are all kinds of dispositions that you develop as a result of being angry. But emotions are just sort of episodes in our life, and I think, although they're fascinating, they're much less useful for what interests me. Moods, on the other hand, are closer to what interests me, but as we usually use the word, moods are thought of as short-lived dispositions, to have certain emotions, to make certain general kinds of evaluations, right? So a good mood disposes you to good feelings, to milder responses to negative events. So if you're already in a good mood and your child spills their milk all over you, you respond better than if you were already not in a good mood. And to seeing the world in more positive terms. Right? So again, there's this element of evaluation. Our affective states affect how we see things, and a mood disposes you to more positive evaluations and appraisals. So affective states, as I'm going to think about them, are the underlying dispositions that shape what emotions you have, what moods you are most regularly in, and they shape your evaluative outlook on your life. And that's the part of affect that interests me the most and that has shaped my thinking about the role of affect in a good life. Okay. Now, I'm never quite sure what to use as a good contrast term. I used to sometimes say, philosophers like, reason and emotion, but I'm not really talking about emotion. I'm not really talking just about reason either. Cognitive doesn't work because it means different things to different disciplines. Psychologists use cognitive in a much broader way than many philosophers do. Clearly, in many senses, much of what I'm calling affect has cognitive components. So that doesn't work. But what I want is a contrast between the affective side of our nature and a certain side of our nature that involves our more deliberate, more conscious thoughts. So attitudes, as I'm going to use the term, refer to our mental states, which, like most of our ordinary conscious beliefs, right, would be attitudes in this sense, are available to conscious reflection. You can call them up easily and think about them. They are more under our voluntary control. They aren't completely, but we have more ability to easily manipulate them as opposed to many of the cognitive contents of our intuitive side of the mind where these things hardly even come up on the radar. And these are states, mental contents, which we can put into language most easily, right, because of the way we have access to them. Okay. Now, hedonism traditionally, well, it focused on pleasure, and so you could debate about exactly what pleasure is, but insofar as people also frame hedonism in terms of happiness, and many of the things that people have discussed in that tradition include affect, right? Part of the problem was that they didn't focus enough on affect and they spent too much time on superficial feelings, but at least there's an element of that tradition focusing on affect. Desire theories, however, and one might be a little bit misled by the word desire, but I take it that desires can be pretty broad, and that insofar as we have desires for a variety of things, what we desire is shaped by what we think is important. So I'm going to take it that desire theories are really focused, they give a prominent place in their theory to our evaluative attitudes, in my sense of attitude, right? The things that you consciously think are important. Someone asks you, what do you desire? Well, the list of things you're going to give is going to be very much shaped by your goals in life, the things you think are important, the relationships you think are important, et cetera, et cetera. And a desire theory basically moves away from focusing on feelings and says that what's good for you is to get what you want, namely, and in most cases that's going to be, to achieve the goals you want to achieve, to have the relationships you want to have, it's going to be a life that tracks, at least to a large extent, your values. Right? So we have these two traditions in philosophy that focus more on the feeling side of things, though it didn't quite get it right, and one that focuses more on the role of what is important to you in your life. And both of these seem to me to get part of it right, but not fully. So I want to start motivating my own view. 7 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go a lot faster. I'm going to focus on an important asymmetry between affect and attitudes. And I'm going to reserve the word suffering for what I'm going to call deeply negative affect. So remember, these would be broad states that influence moods and emotions and that have deeply negative evaluative outlook. When you're in that kind of a state and it's extremely negative, depression would be a good example. That's what I'm going to call suffering. Okay. Here's the basic idea behind the theory. As I said, a theory of well-being has to give you a ranking of possible continuations of a life. The theory I'm proposing produces a ranking by first making two separate types of ranking and then combining them in a novel way. Okay. So when I say I'm thinking about possible continuations of a life, I'm thinking about ways in which you might, combinations of ways in which you might answer questions like this and think about possible ways of continuing with your life. Okay. So the first ranking goes something like this. You ask yourself, for some subject, some particular person, how would a well-informed, I don't actually go say fully informed, I'm skeptical about that, but anyway, a well-informed S, rank the possible continuations of S's life. And I think what you're going to get is a sense of where S's values are currently, given who S is right now, what they care most about, will be reflected in their sense of which are the ways they want their life to continue. Now, set that aside. Forget we did that, just put it over to the side a minute. Imagine now that you had some way to rank the possible continuations of S's life in terms of their affective tone, like the overall, right? There might be some ways of continuing in life that would be dominated by deep depression. And there might be some ways of continuing in life that would be dominated by, you can say happiness. Imagine the people in Dan's eudonia, right? Their dominant affective tone is somewhere up high, right? Okay, so you can rank the ways of living that in terms of that. Now let's posit, I'm not saying I know empirically where this would be, but let's posit this idea that there's a point at which evaluative distortion of negative affect becomes quite severe. In itself, making the experience, having negative affect itself is affecting your ability to appreciate and enjoy and get value from other things in your life. And perhaps at a certain point, it undermines attempts to compensate with other lives. So it no longer makes sense to say, this continuation of a life would have lots and lots of depression in it. But That's okay because I'd accomplish a ton of goals. At a certain point, you might not be able to accomplish a lot of goals if you're too depressed, or you might not be able to enjoy the accomplishment. Let's call that the limiting line for affect. Now put it all together. The basic idea is that we say that any life, possible life above the line, is going to be better than a life below it. Lives above the line we're going to rank, much as a desire theorist would. They're ranked in terms of the subject's informed preferences. Lives below the line, instead, are ranked in terms of affect, with the best affect closest to the line getting worse as you go down. Within affect levels, we might then give priority to a person's preferences, but below the line, preferences don't rule. Okay. So I'll give you a very simple illustration and stop. Let letters be used to illustrate, to rank value sets in ways of the subject's values. So A is the best from the subject's point of view, B, so forth. Let numbers be the affect ways of ranking, and 10 be good, and 0 is the worst misery you can imagine, right? And just for the sake of simplicity, let's 5 be the limiting line. So a life that had an affect level of 4 or 3 is below the line. It's a pretty seriously negative existence. So imagine that you have a subject who's ranked, for whatever reason, the life that they best, that they care most about given who they are right now, their A ranking nonetheless has an affect level of 2. Their second one still has one that falls below the line, level 4. Some lives that are not very highly ranked by them, given their current set of values, nonetheless would lead them above the line. That's the 6 and 8. The theory is going to say something like this. Well, actually, it's not going to say something. It's going to say this. The best option is not going to be what S most prefers, but it's going to be a life above the line. However, it's not the life that's the happiest. That would be level 8, right? What's going to be best, once you get above the line, then you rank in terms of the subject's priorities. So the subject prefers 6 to this life is the E to F, so it's the best. This is second. But once you get to these two lives, because they are at affect levels below the line, then they get ranked lower and in terms of affect. Right. Now, I have to stop, so I'll just pause there and say 2 things. I hope many people had a chance to read the paper because I give an extended example there, which I could map onto this so it's not so extreme. And maybe in the Q&A we can do that. Second, there may be some issues about, this may be too simplistic, even though it doesn't seem very simplistic in some ways, but maybe that we need more gradations in the scheme, and I'm open to discussing that. But this is how I started by thinking about how to try to combine the thought that happiness is important, but it's not the most important thing when your life is going well. But suffering is deeply important, and I've tried both to develop an account of why it is, by looking at the ways in which negative affect influences our evaluative outlook, and capture its badness in a theory. I'll stop. Thank you.
You guys want to, why don't you sit up here? I'm going to ask a quick question, and then I'll just take hands. I don't know everyone in the room. I think I'll just call on people. I'll just see whether we can get the
I'll just turn this
windows
off.
up and the lights up to increase our happiness. In here. All right, that was great. I have a question for, I guess, really for both of you. I mean, so what's striking in a way is how much you agree on it. In fact, this is my view as well, so maybe I picked out what I see as both correct and the area of agreement, but both of you adopt a kind of well, one might call it desire-based or value-based, a kind of a first-person sort of prudential subjectivism, right? What is good for someone, someone's life goes better, that depends in some sense on her values, right? Now, it might be that these are values, these aren't brute preferences, but you know, preferences informed by some sense of what's better, but still it's a kind of a view of well-being that looks to someone's own evaluations, right? Point number one. Point number two is that, I think that both of you agree, that happiness or good experiences, mental states, even in a broad sense, right, what goes on in someone's head is not the only thing that that person might value for herself. It's one of the things, not the only thing. Third point is that affective dispositions, right? So Dan's EWB, or your Jenny's notion of an affective disposition, not just feelings of pleasure, but the underlying disposition, right, the character state, or what have you, that gives rise to those on an ongoing basis, is something which either people generally value or people should value, right? So it's one of the very important things, one of the very important aspects of well-being, given this kind of you know, broad-gauged subjectivism about well-being. So all of that, I think, is right and very plausible. But in both the papers, and again, more in the paper than the presentation, but Jenny, certainly in your presentation, there's a tendency not just to say that, but to give a lot of priority to EWB or affective dispositions, right? So you say, you know, if we're looking for a single headline measure, maybe it's EWB. And Jenny, in your ranking of lives, you explicitly give priority to affect. That is, if, as between lies below the line, affect ranks them, and moreover, regardless of your values, we're going to first say bring you above the line, right? So my question is, so one is that observation. The other point is that, to me, affective disposition, EWB, looks just a lot like what Rawls called primary goods, right? Rawls says primary goods are things that people want, or is useful to give people whatever else they want, right? So income is a primary good. Generally, you know, whatever you value, you're going to be able to do better given income. Liberties are primary goods. So if, given the view of well-being that I take it both of you adopt, why give priority to EWB? Why not say, yeah, this is one of the important kind of resources, but there are other things as well, right?
Do you want to go or you want me?
It doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, on my view, first of all, I don't give equal priority to affect. I give priority to negative affect, in a way. In other words, what I say is that we should be much more concerned about suffering than we should be about happiness. That's my bottom line, right? So I think it makes perfect sense sometimes to not, I mean, if you're at least at a relatively decent level of affect, to think it doesn't matter whether you're blissful. You know, you might have reasons to choose projects or pursue aims that will not be compatible with you being as maximally happy as you possibly could be, but that's okay. That can make sense. There's an asymmetry, however. I do think that negative affect really undermines your capacity as a valuing person, as a valuing agent, and it is worse. And I think I don't know of anybody else who's tried to develop this kind of a theory, but the idea that there's an asymmetry between suffering and happiness has a historical, has been made, that observation's been made before. And I think that if there was a truth in hedonism, it was that bad experience does account for ill-being, even if good experience isn't all there is to well-being. I don't know if that totally answers you, but that's where I'm coming from. Right? So I'm happy to allow that it's only one of many good things. Good affect is one of many good things, and not necessary to maximize it in any sense. But I do think we lose sight of something important if we lose sight of the badness of suffering.
Yeah, and I think our views of well-being are maybe sort of converging in important ways. But now the kind of the very roughly preference-based approach to well-being for policy that I use in the paper and the talk is, I take that as a essentially a pragmatic position for policy purposes that. So, in my own substantive account of well-being, I consider it an objective account of well-being. I just don't think policymakers are entitled to use it for shaping policy. But in terms of the importance of emotional well-being, I think there's certainly lots of stuff it misses, and ultimately in the field, it will be, I guess time will tell how much it misses and how badly. But my own sense, a conjecture I've been making is that in a lot of kind of common sense psychology, people use emotional well-being as essentially a proxy for well-being. So if you find out somebody's happy in an emotional sense, then that tends to, okay, well, they're probably doing pretty well. If they're unhappy, that they're probably doing badly. Now, there are certainly cases where there's going to be real divergence. For instance, the dialysis patients, at least as far as we can tell, maybe the measures are just missing something, but it may also be that it's not showing much of an impact, I think, on emotional well-being either. But in that case, it's not. That's a really significant fact. If in fact it turns out that being on dialysis, well, it's definitely not a good thing, but you actually manage to be pretty happy, and just as happy as if you weren't on dialysis, in the sense of, emotionally leading just as fulfilling and enjoyable life, then that seems, that's saying a lot for it. And so I think it's a relatively, whereas the other things people value, other preferences people have, are so diverse. It's hard for me to see what else would be anywhere near that as as anything like a proxy for well-being.
Just a quick, but in terms, so to bring us back to policy, GDP historically is, at least, well, both within a country and across nationally, an important thing. Liberties are looked at. So if one operationalizes student policy, that would say that what we should do in different countries is to look solely at something like EWB of the average person, the distributions, and to ignore things like GDP or the degree of political liberties and so forth. And that strikes me as being problematic, given your view of well-being, right? If the view of well-being is kind of this, a broadly preference-based view, well, yeah, it's true that having more EWB is a useful thing, but also it's true that having more resources and more liberties is useful, right?
I'm not a consequentialist anyway, so I think liberties are something that liberty, there's good evidence that liberty tends to promote well-being, but I think they matter quite independently of that, and that people have, the standard liberal rights are justified independently of well-being. And I think actually there are I think there's reasons to doubt consequentialism as an account of as a moral theory, because I doubt that there's a tight enough connection between liberty and well-being to really justify traditional liberal rights. I would not want to, I guess one of the worries I have about the well-being policy is that the same mistake that was made with GDP will happen, which is, when they came up with GDP, the guys who fashioned it, they said, this is not a complete social welfare measure, and it ends up, but you get a number and then it ends up eating everything else, and just the blob. And so I would hate to see emotional well-being take that kind of role. But my view is just, if you could only look at one piece of information, I would think about well-being, that would be high on the list, I think.
All right, let's go. Questions? Oh, Peter.
Well, I think Peter Ubel, Duke University. So I'd actually like to take the role of an impatient politician or policy wonk or something, right? And I know there's not going to be a single measure that you're all going to agree on, and that will capture everything. But I'm not happy with, we're going to have some theory that doesn't leave me with some measure I can quantify. I want something else other than GDP to look at, right? So what would it take to get the kind of thinking the two of you are doing to at least get us a sense of, well, what kind of measures you're going to use, how are you going to combine them into some numerical scale. And that's already a challenge. I mean, even some of the well-being scales, or not, I remember what you called them, they were but some of the quality life scales that we use in mental health and in healthcare settings. It's kind of arbitrary how they take all the different things they've measured and give a summary number. But at least they have summary numbers out there, and we use them. What would you guys do to take your theories and get them to an actual, scale?
Well, yeah, since I'm at least pretending to say something that's supposed to be relevant for policymakers, and not just operating at the level of basic theory, I think personally, I'm not a big fan of like composite indexes, and I don't have a lot of actual policy experience. I have very little really. I've spent some time in Bhutan dealing with them, and there you see like they have this gross national happiness index, and because of like they actually think subjective well-being is sort of what justifies the entire list of items in their gross national happiness index, which includes things like education, health, community vitality, and so forth. But they're justified in terms of their perceived relation to subjective well-being. But the actual subjective well-being measures don't get very much weight because they don't trust them. So there's reliability questions that is really beyond my company. Like, are those measures really reliable enough? But you look at their gross national happiness index, and like the blizzard of information they get with their 72 indicators and 42-page questionnaire is great. And I kind of wish they would resist the temptation to sum it all up in one number because it's totally arbitrary. But on the other hand, from a practical standpoint, I'm not a politician, so I don't know, what happens when you don't have a number. And so maybe you just make a deal with the devil and you create a composite index and you realize it's arbitrary and you just hope it doesn't do too much damage or it does more good than harm. But I don't really have any general guidance on that. I guess, sort of I say, these are the things, this is why these bits of information matter, why it'd be nice to have them. You guys figure out what to do with it.
I mean, my paper isn't trying to even comment on policy, but to some extent, I guess, I do hope that the structure of the theory would cause us to reflect a little bit on this point about asymmetry. And so rather than simply focus on determining who's well off, but also really pay attention to measures of ill-being. And I guess I would think of those in terms of emotional well-being. But I don't know if I don't mean therefore that I'm resistant to a single scale, right? But I do think that that would be a good input to have. Ways of tracking, I mean, one of the things I like that Dan says was that you can have people who can function fairly decently in certain ways, and yet who may be quite low on emotional well-being. And looking for some kind of measure that tracks that and catches it would be really quite helpful. And I doubt that just life satisfaction surveys as they exist do that. Right? So adding something that captures that dimension would be useful.
So we don't necessarily have to do ping pong. So any more comments on this question of, number one, should we have a single measure or should we just have a composite? If so, to what extent, how should happiness figure in that measure? Any comments on that or questions about that? I thought we can go to the next. Sorry.
Yeah, so I have a comment on that, but I wanted first to ask you a question. Jennifer, I think I missed something about the framework. So the person who ranked A above B, the rational, well-informed person who ranked A above B, knew that affect level in A would be 2 and B would be 4, and supposedly took it into consideration when they ranked A above B, and you still want to override Okay, so you are saying that the ranking would have inputs into it, all kinds of input, but you want to single out one of the inputs and say, that you have to pass a line there before I even listen to you. Although I know that through your well-informed, rational ranking, you already took it into account and perhaps gave it a very small weight.
Well, one of the things that interests me is the way in which it's very difficult to, for people to evaluate affect and emotional states, even with information, if by information you mean knowing a lot of facts about, well, even with experience, because it's very hard to, there's fascinating work on our ability to remember vividly emotional experiences that we aren't currently having. So I do think sometimes what's salient to people when they're making decisions are going to be more things about what they value, and they may disproportionately not, or they may not be capable fully of appreciating either when they're not depressed what it would mean to be severely depressed, and vice versa. You find people who they lose sense of what it would be like to be in a different affective state. I don't think this is common, right? I don't think, but I think there are cases that you can't otherwise account for, and that wasn't built into the presentation for time, but that is one of the motivations that originally led me to developing the theory. So a traditional desire theory that says fully informed person, whatever they want is what's right for them. I don't think even a fully informed person is going to really be capable of appreciating all the different kinds of affective states they might inhabit, right? Facts don't give you that. And when you're presumably the fully informed person is in some affective state or other, which means that what's salient to them and what they can most easily grasp are emotional states similar to what they're in. It's very hard to grasp the meaning of being in some radically different state. And concerns about that kind of thing is what led me towards a view that doesn't, it tries to give as much room as possible to people's preferences, but below a certain point, which I think is probably pretty low, but below a certain point it stops paying attention to that. Does that help? I mean, at least explain what's going on there.
More comments right on this. So priority for avoiding suffering, or
I'd like to follow up on that if I could. It's kind of a two-part thought on the separation of your two elements. It strikes me that if Aristotle were an economist, he'd say that affective state is endogenous. And so when I consider life path A, part of what I need to do in my life is become the kind of person for whom the affective state of that course of action, which I'm presuming is what the other side is, would be above the bar. So if I can't contemplate that now, I could ask myself, what would I have to do? How would I have to evolve as a person in order for my affective state to change over time? And I wonder whether your theory contemplates that. And if I may, just on the flip side, I'm wondering, I think this is a bit of a follow-up to this question, why I'm not considered in my choice of A, B, C, and D. Why, what is my role as, an objective human being in the whole mix that causes this disparity? And I don't think either of these is a critique, but I just wonder what you would, they're just kind of my immediate thoughts, and I wonder how you would sort of respond to that.
Okay. I'm not quite sure I understood the Aristotle question. I mean, so Aristotle would...
I can explain it if you'd like.
Yeah, explain it again and then see if I can...
So part of Aristotle's ethics is becoming the kind of person you become.
Right.
What that means is developing character.
Of
Character,
course.
a set of dispositions to respond emotionally to different situations in different ways. So you can think of it as shaping your character. In other words, your dispositions to react, respond. I think it's sort of modulating your affective state so that you respond in the right way as opposed
Yes.
to the wrong way.
Okay. Well, so one question is what the, and so that's there's a lot going on there. So first of all, Aristotle's interested in character, probably in a narrower sense than, I mean, an interesting sense. I like Aristotle, but I'm interested in very broadly our affective dispositions and the ways these affect us. But what got me interested in this was, okay, suppose from where I am now, I'm trying to figure out what would be the best way for me to go forward. And part of, I think, what we value and what we see as valuable at a given moment places a huge constraint on what's going to seem most important to us in the future. So if I don't already value, I mean, Aristotle might say, okay, you should value certain character traits, and then if you do, then that might give you, and you realize you can't possess those traits until you acquire a certain affective disposition, then you would, of course, be motivated to try to acquire that disposition. But what interests me is, how do I get you to the point where you see the benefits for you of acquiring the virtue? Because apart from, that's going to be the first step, right, in the way you've set it up. How do you get to the point where you recognize the role of affect, in particular because I see affect is so tied up with your evaluative outlook. If you don't yet have that evaluative outlook, how do you get to the point where you appreciate it? And I kept thinking a lot about the ways in which, here's one example that I used to think about quite a bit. There's a literature, as I'm sure many of you know, comes up partly in response to the capabilities approach and a lot of discussion of, to what extent it makes sense to whether we should or should not honor the preferences of people living under oppressed conditions, right? And you get, on the one side, you get people who say, well, we should always take people's preferences at face value because to do anything else would be disrespectful. And we can't impose our values on others. And on the other hand, you get people who prefer, because they feel convinced that certain lives that people simply accept can't possibly be good for them, so they want to go towards some kind of objective list theory. One of the things that always interested me was...
Do they just accept the lives, or do they rank them above other possible lives?
Well, one thing is interesting, yes. Sometimes some of the cases people present could be, some of them are just accepting. Some seem to be, through lack of information, cases where people don't know of alternatives.
You assumed well-informedness. So
yes, but if you're well-informed. But I think there is still a third category of cases where people, for example, suppose you have someone who is living in oppressed conditions and who has reached a certain level of depression, say. And you inform this person that there are other ways they could be living. It would require them to step out of certain traditional roles, to move away from a kind of life that's familiar to them. They could understand the facts in the sense of what kind of life you're describing and what kind of changes they would have to make. From their given position, especially if they've been brought up to hold certain values that make that way of life seem right to them, they may be reluctant to do so. And then you ask, well, would the knowledge that doing so would improve their affect be enough to make them decide that these moves make sense? I think it's at least possible that it might not, because given that they've been depressed for a long time, they don't know what it feels like not to be depressed. Moreover, they're in a current state where their evaluative outlook is very much shaped by their long-term affect. And it may not seem that it's worth it. It may just not seem important enough. They may not place enough importance on their own well-being. There are various ways you can tell the story. But you might think that the combination of the current values they have, the fact that improving their life would require some sort of shift away from some of those values, and the fact that they're currently in a deeply negative affective state, all three together might give you a case where the person, even with information, won't choose a life that intuitively would be better for them. At least I have the intuition. My thought when I listened to the discussions of, to back up, I was saying, you get these two camps that say people living under oppressed conditions, we have to pay attention to their preferences, and you get camps that say we shouldn't. Mine is I always want to know what are the effects psychologically of those oppressive conditions on those people. Because I can imagine that there are cases where people live with lives quite different from what we Westerners might think of as good lives, and we should respect their preferences. And then I imagine there are cases where perhaps because of the effects of the oppression we should not. And one thing I think of my theory is trying to do is to begin to spell out, find a middle view. It tells you that you don't take people's preferences at face value in cases where they're in deeply negative affect, because their evaluative perceptions are incredibly distorted, and they may not be able to appreciate something that were they then to get to it, they would appreciate.
So why don't we take a bunch of comments, and then you guys can think of whether you want to respond to them or not, or whether you can respond.
Yeah.
But I know a bunch of people are sitting there eagerly waiting to go. Peter, you were waiting for a while. And then
Well, first I had a favorable, what I hope is a helpful footnote for Jennifer, and then a question for Dan. The helpful footnote is Roy Baumeister and colleagues did a meta-survey a number of years ago of psychological effects. Large number of experiments were surveyed, and they found systematically negative effects registered more heavily and had more behavioral consequences than positive ones.
Okay.
So you might find that interesting. There's a little evolutionary story there. You don't have to be happy every day, but you have to not die every day. A question for Dan about the justification for using the subjective measures in policy making, or restricting policy making to subjective measures. So one view you might have of that is a sort of epistemic one. That is to say, there are objective goods out there, as you agree, and it's hard to agree about them. The best we can do is to provide conditions in which people try different lives and come up with opinions, and so we allow that to be determinative in policy making because it's the best we can do epistemically, but in so doing, we're justifying that by appeal to the thought that, well, there is some objective notion of well-being out there that we think people are reasonably good at getting at in these ways. So that would be the epistemic justification. And then you'd say, since we can't typically get high levels of agreement on all areas, for a lot of these things we'll have to use subjective indicators. If we could get a lot of agreement around certain areas, then we could go ahead and use objective measures, and there'd be nothing wrong with that. So that's the epistemic picture. Then there's the sort of normative picture in which you actually think it's normatively inappropriate to use an objective measure for policy reasons. You think that even when people converge, and even when we got robust agreement about certain things being goods, and that seems to be stable under information and life experimentation, we still should not pay attention to those goods in particular and not make policy on that basis.
Let's go.
Oh,
Yeah.
Walter, do you want to?
I also had a question for you, Dan. I wanted to invite you to elaborate a little bit on the nature of your project. So early on, you were talking about how, or you indicated that you were interested in a headline indicator, and you talked about that as something that might be used in conjunction with GDP, or that might potentially supplant it. And so that suggests that you're talking about national level indicators. But then, to be blunt, it seemed that many of the considerations that you offered in support of your view are sort of irrelevant to that purpose. So when you talked about life satisfaction measures, you talked about how it's difficult to come up with this, a number to that, right? It requires some complex judgment. And that's true. And if I give you a number representing my life satisfaction, that's a reason for you not to put too much weight on that, or to judge that the actual number might be quite far away from the real thing, right? But if you're interested in life satisfaction as a national indicator, that's the average life satisfaction across the population or whatever, I know it's difficult to come up with these numbers, but the question then is going to be, are these differences systematic or are they random? Are they large or are they small? Those are the sorts of considerations you need to give me, to convince me that the life satisfaction measure is not going to do a very good job of representing the real thing.
Just following up also on this point, let's agree on something. I think life satisfaction is something that measures very well the shocks, but then you revert to a baseline. So it's good to measure in shock. It's not that good to measure in stock. Now, if you take this perspective, you are comparing two economies, or two worlds, like you call them. One which delivered a lot of bad shocks and has low life satisfaction, and the other that delivers a lot of good shocks and has higher. I still prefer the one delivering a lot of good shocks. Let me get back a bit. Let me just put things in a slightly different way. If the adaptation is not per se a reason to dismiss life satisfaction as a measure of welfare.
So we have, in effect, a lot of the conversation at this point has been substantive, and now we have two new perspectives. I mean, Peter is putting on the table kind of metaethical perspective. I mean, ironically, because I think of Peter as being one of the most famous metaethical subjectivists, he's saying, well, what if, moral truth is just objective, right? Why look to these? And Eric's question, in effect, is putting the econometrics on the table, right? Yeah, it might be true, assuming that we have, the right kind of metaethical and substantive story. It might be true that life satisfaction is not perfect for various reasons, but econometrically, doesn't that all wash out, right? If one is, one has a suitable metaethics and substantive theory such that we're looking to people's values, shouldn't we now be thinking econometrically and think about whether the measure is good enough, right? So, respond as you see fit to that.
I guess on Peter's question, so the background here is this pragmatic subjectivism that Valerie Tiberius and I have been pushing, and the idea, and I consider myself an objectivist, she's the subjectivist, but we think you got to set aside our views of well-being and for policy purposes promote well-being as people see it. But actually, that allows that policy could promote. I mean, let's say you've got a population of Aristotelians, or maybe in Manhattan, people are very they value achievement as some sort of objective good. Then in that kind of a polity, then to the extent that the population has those kind of values, then that can be one of the things you look at in promoting well-being. I would say beyond subjective well-being, to me the most interesting additional indicators to look at. I mean, I think actually the list should be very long. I mean, Bhutan just has this fabulously long list of questions. It takes them like 6 hours to give the questionnaire or something. It is just the eudaimonic measures, and really because I think actually Aristotelian type ideas are actually pretty prevalent in a lot of populations, and it should somehow play in there. I don't know exactly what government should do with it, because some people may say, hey, I don't care about achievement, I just want to have fun. And you don't want to impose that on people, but you also want to respect the values of people who do value achievement. So it doesn't rule out using objective indicators. And this, these are just the ones that I think are going to be relatively the least controversial. Everybody wants to not be depressed and not anxious, and well, not everybody wants to be not anxious, but anyway, close enough. On Eric's question, I do think actually, I've softened a lot on the life evaluation measures, the global, for one thing, after being in Bhutan, and, they're like, well, what do we do? We can't make up all this stuff now. Okay, well, the Cantrell ladder. And because that stuff like the gymnastics routine, the apples and oranges problem, I think that will tend to wash out over large populations, over large samples, and that's why they're still useful measures. I think actually a lot of good would be done if simply people stopped reading them as telling us that people are happy or unhappy and just looked at, well, this group is reporting higher life satisfaction than that group. And then you have to make the further step. There's no reason to think that there's biases that are, that there's an artifact of biases but like in Bhutan, their one kind of global happiness question, urban people score slightly higher than rural people, but it's a mixed bag in the other indicators. Rural people do better in some areas, urban in others. Is it that they're genuinely doing better in the urban areas, or is it that urban people are now in the wage economy and they have to sell themselves, and and they also just ditch their families, and they have to kind of justify it. So is it a positivity bias? I don't know, and there isn't a lot of converging evidence to really explain that. Is it Eugenio? I'm sorry. I missed kind of the last part of your question.
Happiness or life satisfaction, like you're saying, measure shocks rather than stocks, in the sense that you tend to revert, okay? Now, even taking this perspective, in my view, it's a useful measure of welfare. Because it's an economy that delivers a lot of good shock is better than an economy that delivers a lot of bad shocks. That's what I'm going to say. So, in a sense, I share your concern for adaptation. Adaptation is a problem. But maybe it's not that. It's not a reason for dismissing the measure.
Yeah, I think I think the adaptation worries have been really overblown, and I think there are a lot of things that we don't adapt to, that fully. And I mean, I think adaptation is probably worse with life satisfaction or stronger with life satisfaction than emotional well-being, but. If people, I guess the worry in the case of life satisfaction is that if what's happening is a kind of intentional adaptation where people's lives are lastingly better after a shock, but their reports return to baseline because, like, say, after having kids, now it's just background information that I have kids, and I have to take a certain perspective before I realize this is a fabulous thing that happened to me. I had kids, so that worries me more. If it's just adaptation as a function of shift of attention, shifting in salience. I certainly don't want to say that even the standard life satisfaction measures aren't useful, just problematic.
Yes. I have a question that follows on Ori's question to
Jennifer from before. So Ori had asked about why you want to deviate from a purely preference-based approach. And I understood your answer as appealing to biases that people have when formulating their what they think they want in some other affective state. There's some kind of projection bias of current affect on the other kind of on what they think they want. So as a behavioral economist, I love thinking about how behavioral biases might inform our theory of welfare. But it wasn't clear to me how exactly it follows from those particular kinds of biases that you have in mind to the very tightly structured theory that you have that says there's a lexicographic ordering below some level, but then it switches to preferences above some level. I mean, it seems to me like you know, and this may be my bias as an economist, but I would love to see the theory, you know, written out formally with the, you know, the projection bias built into the model, and then kind of deriving the welfare theory from the assumptions. Or at least I'd like to be reassured that I understand all of the assumptions that are going into generating the welfare theory that you come out with.
Any other comment? I mean, this in a way, I mean, there's a specific question that's very important, but it's a more general theme of, given that valuations can differ, and indeed, given that the effective condition of the person doing the valuation can change the valuation, how should we deal with that? I mean, this strikes me as being very important. It relates to something that Peter, you know, one knows the quality literature, right? This is akin to the problem, do we look at the preferences of our health states of people who are sick, or to the preferences of people in the general population? It's a similar problem, right? If you're in the general population, you may not appreciate the bad health state. On the other hand, if you're sick, the preferences might be biased. I mean, the problem here is very much like this, and very important. So other general comments on how we're, I mean, even if one is looking at valuations, how do we accommodate the fact that valuations are different under different effective conditions? Walter.
So, and this is along the same lines, I think it's relevant to this, is I want to get straight to what counts as well-informed, and because what kind of information. I mean, if someone who is depressed, as you said, Jenny, doesn't really appreciate what it's like to be in these other states, then they're not informed. And if, in fact, the correct ranking is 1/2 at the bottom of your handout, and they don't know that, they're ranking A over E, then they're not informed. And so I'm not sure what exactly is necessary in the theory to count as well-informed. I just want to get straight on that to try to understand the theory better.
Can I also just add to that set of questions that does this person necessarily choose 1/2? I couldn't tell from what you were saying.
Yeah, that's.
I may just be reframing what was already a poorly framed question that I began with earlier, but it's getting a little bit at what Dan's doing. Is I feel like I'm trying to figure out what work you do, what you can do philosophically to get us closer to, from what I felt from both your talks was, well, look, there's all these different measures, none of them are perfect, so we can't rely on any one of them, but, you know, I feel like this one's probably, you know, Dan, you're like, I think this one's probably better than the rest, and Jenny, it's like, and I think we're underweighting this. But once you start saying things like better than, underweighting, I'm like, okay, then how do you get from your theories towards, well, what kind of weights would you put on it? And so once you've measured both positive and negative affect, how are you going to weight those to at least, or what are you going to do other than just say, well, and keep in mind that maybe we don't give enough weight to negative affect? Is there anything that can get us further than that?
Well, but in a way, Jenny has given us a very specific theory. This goes back to Dan's question. Jenny has given us a very specific theory which says we give priority to avoiding falling below an affect, you know, and then the question is how do we...
I guess then I just get frustrated how you have a dichotomy, how you have this threshold thing when there's a continuous measure, and where it seems like you'd instead, I would think, you just have a weight that you put on it. But...
So Jenny, you want to...
Okay, so there's several questions here. Let me start with Peter, because it's just most recent. I guess what I like about the approach I'm taking is the questions it gets me to ask. What interests me about trying to draw a line is the thought that there must be, that if you take seriously this idea of evaluative perspective and the ways in which affect shapes it, then even if it's turns out that your line is quite low, that very few lives are falling below it, it'd be interesting to try to figure out at what point how to understand the ways in which affects shape evaluative perspective. What do we? It seems to me that at a certain point, and I think this is true of severe depression, that the negative outlook generated makes it the case that you can't really derive value from much else. So, right, it no longer would make sense to say, well, I'm really, really depressed, but there are these other good things in my life. Because those other good things aren't good for you anymore. You can't, it's hard to see in what sense, because you won't be appreciating them if you really are that depressed. So I'd be interested in more understanding along those lines. And as a philosopher, I start from trying to look at, the way the theory will guide me to ask the next, hopefully interesting question. So for me, negative affect, yeah, you're right. I start from thought, well, we've overlooked that. We need to pay more attention to it. How much weight do we give it? I think we need to ask more questions, but one of the things we need to understand is the way in which it shapes your ability to appreciate other goods, because that's going to tell you how to weight it. I don't know if that helps at all. But Walter asked about well-informed. And this is a question, you've asked me this before, Walter, so I know several times. So, yeah. Well, there are these different approaches, right? I mean, you could say, well, if there's something somebody's missing, they're not well informed. And then you've stipulated that no matter what processes you've described that the person has undergone, they're not well informed until you're confident that they produce the right judgments. Or you could start from the other direction and try to say what you think it is to be well informed, and then after you've given the best specification of that you can, ask whether someone having undergone those processes is immune, whether you have that kind of confidence in them. So I started from my understanding of at least some of the theories out there that are informed desire theories, that what you're supposed to imagine is someone who is, you don't change their personality, you don't change their emotions. What you do is you change you give them facts, right, propositions that they grasp, and you give them, some devices that you can try to give them, things to help them appreciate those facts. What exactly appreciation amounts to is quite hard, but we do understand that there are levels of ways in which we take in information. And you eliminate certain obvious logical errors and rational errors. It seems to me that someone could possess a large number of facts, and maybe even because they've contemplated certain things vividly and whatnot, come to appreciate some. But I'm not sure there's something as simple as appreciation across the board. For example, it seems to me that what you appreciate at any given time is largely shaped by the current affective state you're in. Now, maybe part of what people have intended to do is, when they talk about full information, is to imagine what we would be like if we weren't limited at all. Not just if our minds were expanded, but if we could somehow change the architecture of the mind or have, non-human minds or something. Then I lose track of what exactly we're talking about. So I've always assumed that I'm to imagine someone who has a mind structured rather like all of ours, but who's had more inputs. And perhaps we have to imagine that mind with a similar structure expanded a bit, because I know mind couldn't hold all the inputs that the fully informed mind is supposed to hold. But maybe yours could, but mine couldn't. But nonetheless, somehow that's a minor change rather than just restructuring the architecture of human minds. So then I imagine a person, they start with a certain set of values, because at any point in our lives we have a certain set of things we care about, certain things seem important. You get a lot of new inputs about facts and information, and following, various suggestions by Brandt and various other members of the audience, we suggest trying to make this information vivid. And I still think, well, okay, but you're in some affective state or other. You've got all these facts, But before you can even move towards making judgments, you have to engage in some project of, sorting them, making some of them salient, deciding which ones are important. And at that point, the values you started with and the affective state you're in are going to play a big role. And it seems to me that while you can solve an awful lot, don't get me wrong, I didn't depart too far from a desire theory in my view, so I obviously think you can get a lot out of informed desires. But I don't think you can get everything, and I worried about that. And so, worrying about our ability to appreciate when we're not depressed, what it's like to appreciate suffering and depression, and to appreciate how that person sees the world, and vice versa, worrying about how someone who's in those states, even with full information, would or would not be able to appreciate what it is to move out of it. I at least think that there are possible cases where full information, in the sense I've sketched, won't do it. Maybe you want to say then they aren't fully informed, and then I want to say, well then, maybe then full information isn't possible. But either way, I want a theory that will correct for those cases, however described. It's the same thing I've said to you before, though, so I know you won't like it.
We have about 7 more minutes, at which point we'll break, a nice long break. I encourage people to go outside and walk around and then come back. But I know, okay, so we've got a bunch of questions. So Jonathan, Wiener, are you still?
Yeah.
Jonathan, Sandy, gentleman here, then Eric, come back to you.
I just wanted to follow the spirit of what some people have already said, notably Peter, but that when we're examining these different kinds of measures or underlying foundations, and then trying to think about how they might be used for policymaking, at least in that context of how they might be used for policymaking, the comparison, I think we should put on the table the comparison not just between a perfect measure and an imperfect measure, but the comparison across multiple imperfect measures. So it may be true that these measures of life satisfaction or life evaluation or subjective well-being or happiness or the other terms we've used are imperfect and they have the shortcomings that have been identified and others. But then what's the alternative that they might be compared to or that they might be replacing? So if we're looking at measures that policymakers, say, in the United States federal government are using for maximizing aggregate social well-being, and they're using willingness to pay as a proxy for some measure of well-being, and that's in turn being measured through revealed preference or stated preference surveys. And at each step there are shortcomings, philosophical and empirical methodological shortcomings. So we ought to be comparing the kinds of, whatever we're calling it, life satisfaction, evaluation, happiness, etc., each of these to the imperfections, the relative imperfections or the relative errors in each of these. That's the broad point that I want to make. And I think that's implicit in what several people have already said, so I don't mean to be repeating it, but I think that ought to be actually up front, at least when we're talking about policymaking or implications for policymaking. And then a more specific point within that is, I thought it was interesting to see in Dan's comments the point that the difference between priorities and values as essentially, I took from that, that the different kinds of heuristic biases might be affecting, surely are affecting the ways that people respond to these life satisfaction surveys or momentary happiness surveys, so forth, which is also a critique that's made of the willingness to pay studies, that heuristic biases are maybe involved there. So that seems to me a fruitful area for further empirical research to try to tease out what are the relative kinds of heuristic skews that are affecting these different measures.
Danny?
Two comments, neither of them profound.
The first is, I think that there's clearly an intimate relationship between what both of you are doing and Herbert Simon's work, particularly his distinction between substantive and procedural rationality, where procedural rationality is anchored in incomplete information and also some notion that there are actual cognitive barriers to human beings engaging in optimization. So when you're talking about satisfaction, satisficing, that's very consistent with Simon's perspective. But the second thing I was wondering is, can you translate these notions of subjective well-being into existing indices of well-being that may have more objective connotations? So is there some way to determine whether there's a correspondence between measures of subjective well-being and things like the UNDP's Human Development Index or its Human Poverty Index? Is there some way in which we can construct a correspondence where we can say that there's a relationship between how people express their sense of well-being with these other independently calculated measures of well-being?
From Duke neurobiology. I'm curious to think a little bit about the difference between applying your ideas of the asymmetry between suffering as more than not happiness and happiness as more than not suffering, individually or as a policy matter to a broad population. Because what I'm thinking of is if you took your threshold value as saying there's some cutoff below which options, I won't quite say are not acceptable, but are much categorically excluded, and try to apply that to something like a gross national happiness index or a policy index, would you not then say that it's not just the aggregate value, happiness or satisfaction, life satisfaction value, but that there would be some people in the population, that as a policy matter, you would not let people fall below that threshold, or that people who fell below that threshold would be in some sense privileged to have their interests weighted differently from those people who are above the threshold. And if you, maybe you could both comment on that, but if so, would it make a difference whether you thought of that as a threshold? In other words, I have, for example, maybe an absolute right not to fall below a certain threshold, or is it more of a weighting issue that the unhappiness, the suffering of members gets weighted differently, but it's not an absolute right?
Eric, quick,
Yes, I had a question also about the threshold. If I understand your view correctly, Jennifer, there are certain discontinuities built into welfare judgment. So suppose I prefer A to B, but B gives me more affect than A. If I'm on the line, then A will be ranked above B for me, right, because I prefer it. But then now suppose I lose epsilon affect, an amount that's so small I might not even detect it. And now all of a sudden B is better than A to me. And now I get another epsilon, and then A is better than B. And one might think that welfare judgments should not be responsive to minor changes like that as a general matter. I'm not sure if this is a problem to you.
All right, so let's have quick responses. One of the theories in having long breaks was that conversation would spill over into hallways. So I'll give each speaker a chance to respond quickly, and then we'll break and continue talking and come back here at 2:15. And there will be coffee and cookies and stuff like that.
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to let Dan answer Sandy, and because I'm not sure about how to develop a correspondence. But Eric, I heard one thing about what priority to give to suffering, and then this issue of the line. I myself struggle with this. There is a certain sort of absurdity in drawing a sharp line, right? Because you do end up with these kinds of cases. On the other hand, gradualism has its problems too, right? It does seem to me like if you think if you don't have a line ever, then you seem committed to the thought that if you just have enough of some other kind of good, you can always compensate for, so there's a certain kind of affective misery, but since you think there are these other goods in life, if you just throw enough of them into the life, then somehow that makes it okay, right? And if I take seriously this idea that that one of the problems is the ability, that affect matters in its own right, but it also matters because of the way in which it enables or disables us to appreciate other things, to draw value from our lives, then I feel like there has to be a point at which that doesn't make sense. So I go back and forth about how to articulate that thought, but that's why, at least at a first pass, I presented it that way. And as for the priority, I don't have a specific view about whether there's an absolute right to be above the line. But I do think it's an important piece of information, not only to know, on average, how well people are doing, but what portion of your population may be, and that they're just being sort of, their low marks are pulling the average down, but not a lot, or maybe, but what proportion of your population is at these low marks? And I do think it could support a kind of some version of a prioritarian view, according to which, you certainly should try, maybe not absolute priority, maybe not, ignoring everything else, but you certainly should give a lot of weight to trying to bring those people above the line, if you can. Certainly, if at the population level it's a significant, it might be a small number relative to population, but it's still an absolute number that's significant. Those are places where I think policymakers need to look. And so I do think that could be an important thing to consider.
I think I want to actually come back to Peter's question. I think actually one route to dealing with problems of weighting is perhaps through the kind of research that like Dan and Ori are doing, or look and see. So an important project is going to be to see what actually do people care about, what do they value, and how well do these subjective well-being measures actually track things that people care about. And it looks like the best evidence is that they do have a pretty close relation to people's values, but it's not perfect. And my hope is that kind of and maybe the kind of surveys that Dan and Ori are doing, or could be used to help in a principled way set on a weighting. But I also think at a certain level, social scientists, researchers, we need to resist policymakers want us to make decisions for them, I think, and take the responsibility in their hands. Like, this is a human judgment at the end of the day, and I can make up a number for you, but it's a balancing act. And just I guess I'll just on Sandy's point, I think a fair amount of work has been done seeing how subjective well-being measures correlate with things like the Human Development Index and other objective measures. And my sense is that they should be, even if it's sort of the thing that maybe would be most likely to be reported on the news, that it should really be incorporated into a suite of both subjective and objective indicators, including things like health, education, and so forth. But it looks like there's a lot of evidence that the HDI just doesn't give enough information by itself, and it really does help to have these psychological measures.